The Interstellar Institute of Strategic Studies occupied a space station that had been deliberately positioned at the gravitational midpoint between three suns, because apparently regular universities were too mainstream for the galactic academic elite. The institution prided itself on producing the finest military minds, strategic geniuses, and tactical philosophers the known universe had to offer, which was a fancy way of saying it churned out overeducated officers who could explain in 17 languages why their battle plan failed spectacularly. The station itself was a marvel of collaborative engineering, built by 6 different species who had somehow agreed on architectural standards after only 2 centuries of committee meetings. Its halls gleamed with bioluminescent panels that adjusted to the visual spectrum preferences of whatever species happened to be walking by, a feature that cost more than some planetary defense budgets, but was apparently essential for proper learning conditions. The academic boards took their institution seriously, perhaps too seriously, given that the entrance exam had a mortality rate that would make most military academies look like daycare centers. Commander Thexvor, a Saurian professor whose scales had faded to a dignified silver after 400 years of disappointing students, stood at the front of Lecture Hall 17. His forearms moved in practice gestures as he manipulated the holographic display, cycling through historical battles with the casual boredom of someone who had seen it all before. Twice. The Advanced Theoretical Warfare and Tactical Philosophy course was mandatory for all third-cycle students, which meant the hall was packed with the cream of galactic military talent, or at least the cream that had survived the first 2 cycles. The student body represented a cross-section of the galactic community, each species bringing their own particular brand of arrogance to the classroom. The Dravine occupied the upper tiers, their crystalline forms refracting light in patterns that supposedly conveyed complex emotional states, but mostly just gave everyone headaches. The Korthax preferred the middle rows, their bulk requiring reinforced seating that the maintenance staff complained about constantly. Scattered throughout were Valorians, Heptans, and a handful of other species whose names required vocal cords humans did not possess. And then there were the humans, all 3 of them, sitting in different sections of the hall as if trying to avoid the collective judgment that came with being the new kids in a school that had been running for millennia. Humanity had been admitted to the greater galactic community only 60 years prior. A blink of an eye in cosmic terms after demonstrating they could achieve faster-than-light travel without immediately blowing themselves up. The fact that they had done so while still figuring out basic planetary cooperation struck most species as either admirably ambitious or terrifyingly reckless. The jury was still out. Professor Thexvor's lecture that morning covered the Krenthian campaigns, a series of battles so ancient that several of the participating civilizations had since evolved into entirely different species. His droning voice carried the particular tone of someone who had given this exact lecture 417 times and would give it 417 more before considering retirement. The decisive factor, Thexvor intoned, manipulating the hologram to show troop movements that had occurred when Earth's dominant life forms were still trying to figure out how to crawl onto land, was the superior coordination of the Krenthian fleet formations. They utilized the gravitational wells of the binary star system to achieve positional advantage, demonstrating that proper understanding of environmental factors remains paramount in any tactical scenario. Most of the class was taking notes with varying degrees of attention. Some were recording the lecture directly into neural implants. Others, like the Dravine, simply absorbed information through their crystalline matrices in ways that made traditional studying look hopelessly primitive. One student in the back was definitely asleep, though in his defense, his species did require 17 hours of rest per cycle. Near the front, practically radiating smugness like a small star, sat Kraith Voss. He was Valorian, a species whose military tradition stretched back 10,000 years and who would absolutely make sure you knew about it within 5 minutes of meeting them. His chitinous exoskeleton bore the deep purple coloring that indicated prime genetic stock, and the ceremonial markings etched into his carapace proclaimed a family lineage of generals, admirals, and strategic masterminds. He sat with the particular posture of someone who had never encountered a situation where he was not the smartest being in the room and had no intention of starting now. Kraith's academic record was, annoyingly for everyone else, actually impressive. Top marks in tactical simulations, published papers on fleet coordination theory, and a string of victories in the Institute's war games that had made him something of a celebrity among the student body. He had that dangerous combination of genuine talent and absolute certainty in his own superiority. The kind that made him insufferable at social gatherings, and even worse, during class discussions. Midway through the hall, taking notes with the focused attention of someone who could not afford to miss anything, sat Lieutenant Maya Chen. Yes, human naming conventions were refreshingly simple compared to the 15-syllable mouthfuls that passed for names in some species. She was of average height for her species, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation military bun, and eyes that tracked the professor's lecture with an intensity that suggested she was actually processing the information rather than just recording it for later. Maya had arrived at the Institute with the weight of human expectations on her shoulders, which was only slightly less pressure than the weight of approximately 6,000 years of being the newest, most primitive species in a community of ancient civilizations. Humans were still figuring out how to not destroy their own planet, while their classmates came from cultures that had solved climate change before developing written language. The pressure to prove humanity belonged here was intense, made worse by the fact that most species viewed humans with the sort of bemused tolerance normally reserved for precocious children who had wandered into an adult conversation. She had learned quickly that the best strategy was to keep her head down, work twice as hard as everyone else, and try very hard not to think about how some of her classmates' ancestors had been building Dyson spheres when her ancestors were still impressed by pointy sticks. The imposter syndrome was real, and it had a whole galaxy's worth of material to work with. Professor Thexvor paused in his lecture, his primary eyes scanning the room while his secondary eyes tracked the holographic display. "Now then," he said, in the tone of someone about to make the class period interesting in ways students would not enjoy. "Who can explain why the Krenthian third-wave assault succeeded where the initial bombardment failed?" Several hands shot up, appendages of various types raised in eager display. Thexvor's gaze swept past them with the cruel deliberation of a predator selecting prey, finally landing on a Hepton student who had been desperately trying to avoid eye contact. The student stammered through an answer about resource allocation and timing, which was technically correct, but delivered with all the confidence of someone being held at gunpoint. Thexvor nodded with the enthusiasm of someone watching paint dry, then opened the question to the wider class. This was when Kraith Voss decided to make everyone's day worse. "If I may, Professor," Kraith said, not actually waiting for permission before standing, his voice carrying the peculiar resonance that Valorian vocal structures produced. The answer, while touching on correct elements, misses the fundamental principle. The Krenthians succeeded because they understood the superiority of coordinated force application. They did not rely on primitive tactics or desperate gambits. They executed doctrine perfectly, as any properly trained military force should. The emphasis on properly trained hung in the air like a challenge. Several students shifted uncomfortably. Everyone knew where this was going. Kraith continued, warming to his theme like a performer who had rehearsed this moment in the shower. This is a lesson some species learn early in their development, while others His mandibles clicked in what passed for a condescending smile. Seemed to favor chaotic, undisciplined approaches that succeed more through luck than skill, throwing bodies at problems rather than applying strategic thinking. Maya felt her jaw tighten. She did not need a translator to know that Little's speech was aimed directly at humanity's military history, which admittedly included some questionable decisions, but also included victories that had surprised everyone, humanity included. Professor Thexavor's scales rippled in a pattern that suggested he was either amused or preparing to molt, both equally likely. An interesting perspective, Cadet Voss. Do you have specific examples of these primitive tactics you reference? Kraith absolutely did, and he had clearly been saving them up. Human military doctrine, for instance, seems to favor what they call innovative thinking, which appears to be code for abandoning proven strategic principles in favor of whatever desperate measure occurs to them in the moment. Their own historical records show a pattern of winning battles through what amounts to tactical chaos. The other two human students in the hall looked like they wanted to melt through their seats and disappear into the station's recycling system. Maya felt her fingers grip her datapad hard enough that the edges bit into her palm. She had two choices here. Let it slide and confirm every stereotype about humans being too primitive for galactic society, or respond and probably make everything worse. She chose option 3. Cadet Voss makes an excellent point, Maya said, standing with deliberate calm, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. Proven strategic principles are certainly valuable. I wonder, though, if he can explain why those principles failed humanity's opponents so consistently throughout our history. The hall went quiet in the way that classrooms do when students sense drama incoming and want to make sure they hear every word for later gossip. Kraith turned to face her, his exoskeleton plates shifting in a display that probably meant something aggressive in Valorian body language. Failed? Kraith's voice carried genuine amusement. I would argue they succeeded in teaching humanity the cost of their primitive approaches. Your casualty rates speak for themselves. True, Maya acknowledged, still standing, still calm, still absolutely done with this nonsense. We lost a lot of people figuring out how to fight. But we won our wars against opponents who followed doctrine perfectly, who had overwhelming advantages, who did everything right according to established tactical theory. And they lost anyway. I am curious about that discrepancy. Professor Thexvor's secondary eyes focused entirely on Maya, a sign that she had his full attention. This was either very good or absolutely terrible. Are you suggesting, Lieutenant Chen, that there is value in abandoning established doctrine? I am suggesting, Professor, that doctrine has its place, but adaptability wins wars. The Krenthians won because they adapted their strategy to the environment. That is not doctrine. That is creative problem-solving with a fleet attached. Kraith's mandibles clicked rapidly, the Valorian equivalent of a derisive snort. How enlightening to hear tactical philosophy from a species whose most celebrated military victory involved hiding in trees and shooting at their opponents. Truly, the heights of strategic thinking. That did it. Maya felt something snap in her chest, not quite anger, more like the breaking point where politeness ends and honest communication begins. Cadet Voss? Since you clearly have strong opinions about human tactical capabilities, perhaps you would be interested in a practical demonstration? The hall's atmosphere shifted immediately. This was no longer a debate, this was a challenge, and everyone knew it. Students who had been half asleep suddenly sat upright. Even the Dravine stopped refracting light in boredom patterns. Kraith's entire posture changed. mandibles spreading in what was definitely a smile now. "Are you challenging me to an academic duel, Lieutenant?" "I am suggesting," Maya said carefully, "that we settle this disagreement through the simulation system. A tactical scenario where we each present our solution. The class and Professor Thexvor can judge which approach demonstrates superior strategic thinking. Unless, of course, you believe human tactics are so primitive they are not worth your time." It was a masterful trap, really. Refuse and look like a coward who could not back up his talk. Accept and risk losing to the species he had just spent 10 minutes insulting. Kraith, to his credit or foolishness, depending on perspective, walked right into it. "Accepted," he said immediately, ego overriding whatever common sense might have urged caution. "I look forward to demonstrating the difference between proper military training and improvisational chaos." Professor Thexvor made a sound that might have been a sigh or might have been a laugh. Hard to tell with Saurian vocal ranges. "Very well. Since you have both volunteered for this educational opportunity, we shall conduct this exercise tomorrow. I will design a scenario that will test your respective approaches. The terms are simple. You will each present your tactical solution, explain your reasoning, and demonstrate the outcome through simulation. The class will evaluate the results. Objective, measurable, and absolutely binding on your final grades." Both students agreed, because at this point backing down would be worse than whatever damage their grades might suffer. Maya sat back down, her heart pounding with the delayed realization that she had just publicly challenged one of the top tactical students in the institute. The confidence that had carried her through the moment was rapidly being replaced by the cold understanding that she now had to actually back up her words. The rest of the lecture passed in a blur. Students kept glancing between Maya and Kraith like spectators at a sporting event, sizing up the competitors. The gambling pools would start immediately. Maya knew, with odds heavily favoring the Valorian, who had years of tactical training and a genetic lineage of military excellence, against the human who had been flying spacecraft for less time than some species spent in educational larval stages. When class finally ended, Maya gathered her materials with hands that were definitely not shaking, "Thank you very much," and headed for the exit. She made it approximately 3 meters before being intercepted by David Kim, one of the other human students, who looked like he could not decide whether to congratulate her or check her for head trauma. "That was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've seen anyone do at this institute," David said quietly. "Kraith has never lost a tactical simulation. Never. His family has been breeding military commanders for longer than our species has had agriculture." "I noticed," Maya said, walking quickly toward the transit tubes. "Too late to back out now. You have a plan, right? Tell me you have a plan." Maya did not have a plan. What she had was approximately 20 hours to develop one. A mounting sense that she had made a terrible mistake, and a stubborn refusal to prove Kraith right about humanity being out of their depth. "I will figure something out." That is exactly the kind of human response that makes other species nervous about us, David muttered, but he was smiling slightly. "Need help researching?" "I need access to Earth's complete military history database, every asymmetric warfare study we have, and about 6 pots of coffee." "Coffee I can do. The rest you can pull from the Institute archives. They have everything, including stuff Earth classified as too embarrassing to admit happened." Maya spent the next 18 hours in a state of focused desperation that was apparently a common human condition. The Institute's archives were indeed comprehensive, containing detailed records of human military history from Bronze Age shield walls to the recent unification wars that had brought Earth together. She read tactical analyses, battle reports, historical accounts, and more than a few unflattering alien assessments of human warfare that basically amounted to, why do they keep winning when they are doing everything wrong? The pattern was undeniable. Humanity had a terrible habit of facing superior opponents and winning anyway through combinations of stubbornness, creativity, and tactical flexibility that looked like chaos from the outside, but had an underlying logic that worked. Guerrilla warfare, asymmetric tactics, psychological operations, and a willingness to try absolutely insane strategies when conventional approaches failed. More importantly, she noticed something about Kraith's previous simulation victories. He was brilliant, no question, but his brilliance operated within established parameters. He followed doctrine beautifully, executed complex maneuvers perfectly, and won through superior coordination and overwhelming force application. His tactics were textbook examples of how warfare should be conducted by properly advanced civilizations, which meant he probably thought in exactly the same patterns, expected opponents to follow similar logic, and would design his solution based on conventional strategic wisdom. Maya began to smile, the slightly unhinged expression of someone who had been awake too long and had just had either a brilliant idea or a complete mental breakdown. Hard to tell which. The next morning arrived with the relentless inevitability of deadlines and poor life choices. Lecture Hall 17 was packed beyond capacity, with students from other courses crammed in to watch what had become the academic event of the cycle. The betting pools had reached significant amounts, with odds running approximately 8-1 against the human, which Maya tried very hard not to think about. Professor Thexavor entered with his usual measured pace, entirely unbothered by the circus atmosphere that had overtaken his classroom. He manipulated the holographic controls, bringing up a tactical display that made several students lean forward with interest. The scenario, Thexavor announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs, is as follows. You are commanding a defensive force protecting a colony world of strategic importance. You have limited resources, a small fleet, and minimal ground forces. The attacking force is 3 times your size, technologically superior, and led by a competent commander following established siege doctrine. Your objective is to defend the colony until reinforcements arrive in 72 hours. Failure means the colony falls and thousands of civilians die. Begin your analysis. It was a classic no-win scenario, the kind of tactical problem designed to test creative thinking under impossible constraints. Maya recognized it immediately as a modified version of historical siege situations that humanity had faced repeatedly, which either meant Thexavor was being fair or setting her up. Possibly both. Kraith went first, because of course he did. Standing before the class with the confidence of someone who had been preparing for moments like this his entire life. His presentation was, infuriatingly, actually excellent. The key to this scenario, Kraith began, his voice steady and assured, is recognizing that defensive operations require maximizing force multiplication through proper positioning and coordinated fire zones. The colony's orbital infrastructure provides natural choke points that can be fortified and defended. His holographic display, lit up with fleet positions, defensive grids, and overlapping fields of fire that turned the space around the colony into a mathematical death trap. He walked through his strategy with professorial clarity, explaining how concentrated firepower at key positions would inflict maximum casualties on the attacking force, how rotating defensive lines would maintain constant pressure, how supply chains would be optimized for sustained resistance. By establishing these defensive parameters, Kraith continued, manipulating the simulation to show attacking forces being systematically ground down, we force the enemy into a war of attrition that favors the defender. Standard siege doctrine states that attackers require 3-to-1 numerical advantage to overcome prepared defenses. They have this advantage, but barely, and the casualties required to breach our positions will be unsustainable. They will be forced to either withdraw or negotiate, giving our reinforcements time to arrive. The simulation played out with mechanical precision. Attacking ships hit the defensive grid and died in calculated numbers. Ground forces attempting landings were intercepted by orbital fire. The colony held, bloodied but intact, until reinforcements arrived to drive off what remained of the attacking fleet. The class erupted in appreciative murmurs. It was a textbook-perfect solution, exactly what military academies across the galaxy would teach as proper defensive doctrine. Kraith had demonstrated superior coordination, optimal resource allocation, and flawless execution of established tactical principles. He sat down with visible satisfaction, having just given a masterclass in how warfare should be conducted by civilized species. Maya stood up, her legs feeling steadier than they had any right to, and walked to the front of the hall. She looked at Kraith's beautiful, perfect tactical display and felt a surge of something that was either confidence or the last gasps of survival instinct. Cadet Voss has presented an excellent solution, Maya began, and saw Kraith's mandibles spread slightly in premature victory. His defensive positions are geometrically optimal, his fire zones are perfectly calculated, and his execution of siege doctrine is flawless, which is precisely the problem. She activated her own holographic display, showing the same starting scenario. This solution assumes the attacking commander is competent and following established doctrine. Professor Thexivor specified that they are. So they will look at Cadet Voss's defensive grid, recognize it as exactly what military theory says they should encounter, and execute their counter-siege doctrine with equal competence. The result is exactly what the simulation showed: a grinding attrition battle that barely favors the defender. Maya began manipulating her own tactical display, and several students leaned forward as they realized her positioning was completely different. But here is the thing about following doctrine perfectly. It makes you predictable, and predictable opponents can be manipulated. Her fleet positions were scattered, seemingly random, with gaps in the defensive grid that made several students mutter in confusion. Her ground forces were not concentrated at strategic points, but dispersed across the colony in ways that appeared to violate every principle of defensive warfare. This looks like chaos, Maya acknowledged, because it is designed to look like chaos. The attacking commander sees our defensive positions and thinks we are incompetent, disorganized, or desperate. They expect easy victory because we are not following doctrine. So they come in aggressively, confidently, exactly how superior forces should engage inferior ones. She ran the simulation forward, and the attacking fleet moved in, taking the bait exactly as expected. But our positions are not random. They are designed to funnel the attacking fleet into specific approach vectors while appearing to be defensive mistakes. Our fleet does not engage directly. We harass and retreat, looking like we are being driven back. The attacking commander's confidence grows. They are winning, according to every tactical indicator they trust. The simulation showed her scattered fleet retreating, drawing the attackers deeper into the colony's orbital space. Ground forces that appeared dispersed were actually positioned along infrastructure choke points. Not military infrastructure, civilian infrastructure. Power grids, communication hubs, life support nodes. When the attacking fleet commits to their assault on what they think is our collapsing defense, we do not fight them ship to ship. Maya's expression was somewhere between a smile and something more predatory. We turn off the colony's power grid, all of it, simultaneously. The orbital platforms, the defense satellites, the communication networks. Everything goes dark. To the attacking commander, it looks like catastrophic systems failure, like the colony's infrastructure just collapsed under their assault. They have won, easily, faster than expected. She paused, letting that sink in. Except we controlled that failure. Our ships are running silent in the dark, using the planet's magnetic field to mask their signatures. Our ground forces are operating on isolated power systems we prepared in advance. And the attacking fleet is now orbiting a dark planet, celebrating their victory, with their formations relaxed and their guard down. The simulation showed what happened next, and several students made sounds of surprise or alarm. Maya's fleet emerged from the planetary shadow not in defensive positions, but in strike formations, hitting the attacking fleet's vulnerable logistics ships and command vessels while they were dispersed and unprepared. Simultaneously, her ground forces activated what they had been positioning all along: surface-to-orbit weaponry hidden in civilian infrastructure, targeting solutions already calculated, firing solutions already programmed. The attacking fleet has superior numbers and technology. Maya continued as the simulation showed the attacking forces scrambling to respond. But they are now reacting to us, fighting in conditions we created, against tactics they did not prepare for because no properly trained military would use them. Their doctrine has no ready response for an opponent who just deliberately destroyed their own infrastructure as a tactical move. The simulation continued its brutal calculus. Attacking ships trying to regroup were harassed by guerrilla fleet actions. Ground commanders attempting to coordinate were disrupted by communication blackouts and infrastructure chaos. The attacking force still had numerical superiority, but they were fighting blind, scattered, and confused. "We do not win through superior firepower," Maya said quietly. "We win by making them fight our kind of battle, not theirs. By 72 hours, they have suffered heavy casualties, accomplished none of their objectives, and face a choice. Commit even more resources to a situation that has already defied all their tactical expectations, or cut their losses and withdraw before reinforcements arrive." She ran the simulation to its conclusion. The attacking fleet withdrew, having lost more ships than Kraith's solution predicted, but having inflicted far fewer casualties on the defenders. The colony was intact, if slightly darker than before. Victory through means that violated approximately every principle of conventional warfare. Maya turned back to the class, finding Kraith's eyes. "You are absolutely right that human tactics look like chaos. They are chaos, controlled chaos, designed to force opponents out of their comfortable doctrinal frameworks. We lose more infrastructure, take more risks, and operate without the safety net of established tactical theory. But we win." The hall was silent for a long moment, the kind of silence that follows when everyone's expectations have been thoroughly disrupted. Professor Thexivor stood slowly, his forearms moving in patterns that suggested he was processing something significant. "Lieutenant Chen," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of 4 centuries of teaching experience, "has just demonstrated why warfare is called an art rather than a science. Cadet Voss executed perfect doctrine and would have achieved victory against any opponent following similar logic. Lieutenant Chen abandoned doctrine entirely and would have achieved victory specifically because her opponent was following doctrine. Thexivor manipulated the holographic display, running both simulations side by side. Against a conventional opponent, Cadet Voss's solution is superior. Against an unconventional opponent, Lieutenant Chen's solution is superior. This is the fundamental lesson. There is no perfect tactical answer, only appropriate responses to specific situations. The mark of a truly superior strategic mind is knowing which approach to apply." he turned to face the class fully. And the mark of a dangerous opponent is being capable of both. Study these solutions carefully. One shows you how warfare should be conducted. The other shows you how warfare actually is conducted when one side refuses to cooperate with the other's expectations. Kraith had not moved. His exoskeleton plates locked in a rigid posture that suggested he was experiencing emotions his species rarely acknowledged. He had been thoroughly, publicly, and completely outmaneuvered by an opponent he had dismissed as primitive. The humiliation was almost physical, made worse by the fact that he could not argue with the results. His solution was perfect doctrine. Hers was perfect adaptation. Both had merit. Only one had surprised everyone. The class erupted in discussion, students debating the merits of both approaches, arguing about doctrine versus flexibility, conventional versus unconventional tactics. The betting pools were in chaos as people tried to figure out who had actually won when both solutions technically succeeded, but one had violated every expectation. Maya gathered her materials, feeling the adrenaline drain away and leave behind exhaustion and relief. She had done it somehow. Proved that humanity belonged here, not by matching galactic standards, but by demonstrating that different standards could be equally valid. David caught up with her in the hallway, grinning like someone who had just won his betting pool, which he probably had. That was absolutely insane. You destroyed your own colony's infrastructure as a tactic. Temporarily, Maya corrected. And it worked. It worked because you thought like a human, which apparently means thinking like a crazy person by galactic standards. You know this is going to follow you for your entire career, right? Every tactical instructor is going to use this scenario as an example. Maya was okay with that. She had come to the Institute carrying the weight of proving humanity belonged among the stars. She had spent months feeling like an imposter, struggling against the assumption that her species was too young, too primitive, too inexperienced to contribute meaningfully to galactic civilization. Turned out, being young and primitive and inexperienced meant approaching problems from angles that ancient, advanced civilizations had forgotten and existed. Humanity's lack of established doctrine was not a weakness. It was freedom to develop tactics that worked regardless of whether they should work according to theory. Over the following days, the story spread through the Institute with the speed that gossip achieves in any academic setting. Kraith avoided her in hallways, which was fine. His ego would recover eventually, or it would not. Either way was his problem. Other students looked at her differently now, not with condescension, but with a wary respect normally reserved for people who might do something unpredictable at any moment. Professor Thexivore incorporated both solutions into his curriculum, using them as case studies for the eternal debate between doctrine and innovation. Maya found herself fielding questions from students who had never spoken to her before, all wanting to understand the human approach to warfare that seemed equal parts genius and insanity. The Interstellar Institute of Strategic Studies continued its mission of educating the finest military minds the galaxy had to offer, processing students through its programs and sending them out to serve their respective civilizations. The station still occupied its position between three suns, still gleamed with expensive bioluminescent panels, still maintained entrance standards that made most military academies look gentle. But now, when students walked past Lecture Hall 17, they remembered the day a human lieutenant had demonstrated that sometimes the best response to superior force and perfect doctrine was controlled chaos and a willingness to break your own infrastructure to break your enemy's expectations. They remembered that warfare was not always won by following rules, but by understanding when rules should be abandoned. And in military academies across dozens of worlds, tactical instructors began teaching a new principle. Never assume your opponent will fight the way you expect them to. especially if that opponent comes from a species young enough and crazy enough to still be figuring out what rules even are. Humanity had entered galactic civilization as primitives, and had somehow turned that primitive status into a tactical advantage. The universe, as it turned out, was full of ancient civilizations who had perfected the art of conventional warfare over millennia of experience. It had been waiting, unknowingly, for someone inexperienced enough to not know that unconventional warfare was not how things were supposed to be done. Maya Chen continued her studies, eventually graduated with honors, and went on to a career that would make her instructors either proud or deeply concerned, depending on their perspective regarding proper military conduct. But that particular day in Lecture Hall 17 remained her defining moment. The time she had been challenged and had responded by teaching an entire classroom full of advanced alien species that sometimes the newest voice in the room has something worth hearing, even if that something involved tactics that made established military doctrine cry itself to sleep at night. Retriclod can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.